The bank lobby smelled faintly of floor polish, old paper, and burnt coffee from a machine humming near the waiting chairs. Most mornings in Pine Hollow moved slowly, but Fridays carried a different rhythm. Payroll checks. Equipment loans. Farmers rushing before noon storms rolled across the valley. The line at the front counter stretched halfway toward the glass doors when the old man stepped inside carrying a dented metal cash box beneath one arm. Nobody looked at him twice. He wore faded denim overalls darkened by years of machine grease, heavy work boots coated in dry field dust, and a brown canvas jacket with one torn cuff stitched carefully by hand. His gray beard had been trimmed unevenly, probably with a mirror hanging beside a farmhouse sink. He removed his cap politely as he entered, exposing flattened white hair beneath it. A few customers glanced at him briefly, then looked away. To them, he was just another aging farmer trying to cash a check before lunch. The branch itself belonged to Mid-State Agricultural Bank, one of the few institutions still operating in 3 surrounding counties after larger chains absorbed most independent lenders over the previous decade. Pine Hollow residents didn't trust outsiders much, so they stayed loyal to familiar logos even when fees quietly climbed year after year. Behind the counter, Assistant Branch Manager Denise Carter barely looked up from her monitor. Next. The old farmer stepped forward slowly and placed the metal cash box carefully on the polished counter surface. "I'd like access to a safety deposit file," he said. Denise kept typing. "Account number?" "I don't have one." That finally made her look up. "No account?" "It's older than that." The line behind him shifted impatiently. Denise forced a thin professional smile. "Sir, safety deposit access requires verification. If you're not listed on an active account, we can't release anything." The old man nodded once, as if he expected the answer. From his jacket pocket, he removed a yellowed envelope folded neatly into thirds. The paper looked decades old. He slid it across the counter without speaking. Denise opened it casually at first. Then slower. Her expression changed almost immediately. She reread the first paragraph. The document carried the faded letterhead of Pine Hollow Cooperative Lending Authority, a farm credit institution dissolved nearly 40 years earlier during a regional banking consolidation. At the bottom sat a stamped acquisition notation connecting its surviving liabilities to Mid-State Agricultural Bank through a merger chain finalized in 1987. Denise frowned. "Where did you get this?" "My father kept it." "Sir, this isn't current documentation. It says records were transferred." The line behind him grew louder. A contractor holding rolled blueprints checked his watch dramatically. A woman near the door sighed hard enough for everyone to hear. Denise glanced toward them apologetically before lowering her voice. "What exactly are you asking for?" The old farmer rested both weathered hands on the counter. "In 1974, my father deposited original land collateral records with the Cooperative Authority after a dispute involving mineral leases." He paused calmly. "I'm here to retrieve those records." Denise blinked twice. "Mineral leases?" "Yes. Sir, we don't handle anything like that here." "You inherited the files." "We inherited old liabilities," she corrected. "Not random paper archives from the 70s. The farmer didn't react emotionally. That almost irritated her more. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elijah Turner." She typed quickly. Nothing appeared. "No active relationship," Denise said flatly. Elijah nodded again, patient as stone. "My father closed his accounts after the foreclosure hearings." Now several people nearby were listening openly. Foreclosure stories traveled through rural towns like weather reports. Everybody knew somebody who lost acreage during the agricultural collapse years. Most conversations ended with bitterness, whiskey, or silence. Denise straightened slightly. "Mr. Turner, without current account verification, we can't authorize archive retrieval requests. Especially not involving legal property disputes from 50 years ago. 48. What? 48 years. She exhaled slowly through her nose. "Sir, even if those files existed, they'd likely be destroyed. Elijah looked toward the framed historical photo hanging behind the teller stations. It showed the original Pine Hollow Cooperative building before Midstate bought it decades earlier. My father was told the same thing in 1982. Denise crossed her arms. And he discovered they weren't destroyed. A quiet pause settled over the counter. For the first time, Denise seemed uncertain whether this conversation was ridiculous or dangerous. What exactly do you think those papers prove? Elijah answered without hesitation. That several farms were transferred illegally through manipulated default valuations tied to buried gas rights. Someone behind him muttered, "Jesus." Denise's professional smile disappeared completely now. "Sir, if you're alleging fraud, you'll need legal representation." "I have it." "Then where's your attorney?" Elijah glanced toward the front windows calmly. "Parking." At almost the exact moment he said it, a dark gray sedan pulled into the nearest handicapped space outside the bank entrance. The driver stepped out holding two thick archive boxes. He wasn't dressed like Pine Hollow locals. Dark navy suit. Expensive leather briefcase. Clean haircut. City shoes unsuited for mud roads. Every head in the lobby turned instinctively. The man entered carrying the boxes carefully in both arms before scanning the room once. Then he walked directly toward Elijah Turner. "Sorry I'm late," he said evenly. "County Records office took longer than expected." Denise stared. The attorney placed both archive boxes onto the counter beside the old metal cash case. One box carried certified registry stamps from the State Land Commission. The other carried federal court archival seals. Then the lawyer reached calmly into his briefcase and produced a formal litigation notice addressed to Midstate Agricultural Bank. And suddenly, nobody in the lobby seemed impatient anymore. The silence inside the bank shifted from irritation to discomfort so quickly that even the air seemed heavier. Denise stared at the litigation notice without touching it. The attorney adjusted the cuff of his coat calmly before extending a business card across the counter. "Daniel Mercer," he said. "Civil property litigation." Denise took the card carefully. The gold lettering beneath his name identified him as senior counsel for a firm based in Chicago, not the kind of legal office usually connected to small-town agricultural disputes. Firms like that represented corporations, utility companies, rail acquisitions, mineral extraction consortiums. Not quiet farmers carrying rusted cash boxes. The contractor standing in line behind Elijah slowly lowered his phone from his ear. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Denise recovered her professional posture enough to speak again. "Sir, legal notices are handled through corporate channels. This branch isn't authorized to discuss litigation matters." Daniel nodded politely. "Of course. That's why we sent certified copies to your regional counsel yesterday morning." He tapped the second archive box lightly. "Today is merely a records preservation request." The phrase landed differently. Records preservation request. Not accusation. Not complaint. Something more procedural. More dangerous. Denise looked toward the glass offices lining the side wall of the lobby. Through one of them, branch manager Carl Whitmore had already noticed the gathering crowd near the counter. He stepped out holding a tablet under one arm, irritation visible before he even reached them. "What's going on here?" Denise handed him the notice immediately. Carl skimmed the first page casually. Then stopped. His eyes moved back to the top. He reread the header more slowly this time. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "this alleges improper collateral reassignment tied to historical mineral rights evaluations." "That's correct. These claims involve transactions from the 70s. Primarily 1974 through 1981. Carl forced a dry laugh. "You can't seriously expect this branch to produce records from half a century ago." Daniel opened the first archive box. Inside sat rows of organized folders marked with county parcel numbers, tax maps, probate transfers, and survey references. Each tab had been color-coded meticulously. "We already located most of them," Daniel replied. Carl's expression tightened. Elijah remained silent beside him, hands resting quietly atop the metal cash box like he had all morning. Daniel removed one folder and opened it carefully. In 1978, he began, Mid-State's predecessor institution reassessed agricultural land values during a regional refinancing initiative. Several family farms were categorized as distressed collateral despite meeting payment terms. He slid a photocopied ledger page across the counter. 3 months later, mineral surveys conducted beneath those same properties projected commercially viable natural gas deposits. Carl didn't touch the paper. Daniel continued. The farms were foreclosed within 18 months. That proves nothing, Carl replied quickly. Not by itself. Daniel removed another document. This does. Denise leaned slightly closer despite herself. The page appeared to be an internal memorandum typed on faded bank stationery. Most of the wording was difficult to read, but one sentence remained unmistakably clear. Delay disclosure of revised extraction estimates until title transfer completion. Carl's face lost color. The contractor behind Elijah whispered softly, "Holy hell." Daniel closed the file again. "We're aware this branch didn't exist under current management at the time," he said calmly. "However, successor institutions inherit both assets and liabilities." Carl straightened immediately. "If you're threatening litigation over sealed historical assessments, you'll need more than partial memos and old surveys." Daniel nodded once. "That's why we're requesting the remaining vault records." Denise finally spoke again. "You really believe something valuable is still in there after all these years?" Elijah answered quietly before Daniel could. "My father believed it." Carl turned toward him sharply. "Mr. Turner, with respect, people lose farms for many reasons. Commodity crashes. Droughts. Missed payments. My father never missed one." Carl hesitated. The certainty in Elijah's voice carried no anger. That made it harder to dismiss. Daniel removed another folder slowly. "Your predecessor institution claimed the Turner property failed collateral sustainability thresholds in September 1979. He opened the file to a highlighted section. Yet 6 weeks earlier, a confidential geological report estimated the underground lease value exceeded the farm's debt by nearly 14 times. Carl folded his arms defensively. "These are allegations." "No," Daniel corrected gently. "Allegations come later." The distinction settled coldly across the counter. Near the waiting chairs, 2 customers pretended to scroll their phones while listening openly now. Even the tellers had stopped working discreetly to watch. Carl lowered his voice. "What exactly are you after here?" Elijah finally opened the metal cash box. Inside sat old receipts, property tax slips, folded letters, and a cloth-wrapped ledger secured with twine darkened from age. Carefully, he removed the ledger. "My father kept records of every meeting," Elijah said. "Every payment. Every delay notice. Every reassessment." He placed the book gently beside the litigation notice. "Before he died, he asked me to bring this here if they ever started drilling west of County Road 8. Daniel glanced toward Carl. "They approved exploratory contracts there last spring." Carl's jaw tightened again. That detail explained something. This wasn't random revenge from a bitter family. Timing mattered. Natural gas prices had climbed sharply over the previous 2 years. Quiet land acquisitions across rural counties had accelerated alongside them. Most residents barely noticed corporate shell companies buying acreage through intermediaries. But somebody had noticed. Somebody patient. Daniel slid another document forward. "This preservation order requests immediate suspension of all document destruction protocols connected to agricultural collateral transfers between 1970 and 1985. He paused. "Failure to comply after notice creates separate liability." Carl finally looked genuinely uneasy. "Corporate legal will handle this." "Excellent. We're done here then." "Not quite." Daniel reached into his briefcase again. This time he produced a notarized authorization signed by a retired probate judge from Pine Hollow County. Denise looked confused. Carl looked terrified. "What is that?" Denise asked. Daniel answered evenly. In 1984, Elijah Turner's father filed a sealed affidavit naming the location of duplicate transfer records stored under custodial protection pending future mineral disputes. He placed the authorization carefully atop the counter. That custodial protection expires today. Carl grabbed the document immediately. His eyes moved rapidly across the page. Then slower. Then back upward again. Because attached behind the affidavit was a property inventory list. And halfway down the second page sat a vault reference number matching a records compartment still registered beneath Midstate Agricultural Bank's archive system. Meaning the documents Elijah claimed existed had never actually disappeared at all. For several long seconds, nobody in the lobby spoke. Carl Whitmore kept staring at the vault reference number as if reading it repeatedly might somehow change it. Denise leaned closer beside him, confusion spreading across her face the moment she recognized the internal coding structure printed at the bottom of the page. It was real. Not copied from public records. Not fabricated from internet archives. Actual internal indexing. The kind only legacy storage systems still used after multiple banking mergers stitched together decades of forgotten paperwork. Carl lowered the document slowly. That compartment should have been purged years ago. Daniel Mercer answered immediately. According to your own retention schedule, custodial legal materials tied to unresolved mineral title disputes are exempt from destruction. Carl looked toward him sharply. You seem unusually familiar with our retention policies. Daniel gave a thin smile. I used to represent banks. That changed the atmosphere again. Because now Carl understood exactly what kind of lawyer stood in front of him. Not a dramatic courtroom personality chasing headlines. Not an activist looking for attention. This was the dangerous kind. The procedural kind. The kind who knew where institutions buried things. Elijah remained beside the counter quietly, almost invisible again now that the legal conversation had taken over. But several people in the lobby kept glancing toward him with new eyes. The old farmer they ignored 15 minutes earlier suddenly seemed connected to something much larger than anybody expected. Carl folded the affidavit carefully. Even if those files still exist, access requires corporate authorization. Daniel nodded once. We anticipated that response. He opened another folder and removed a stamped county order. Under successor liability review statutes, parties named in sealed custodial affidavits may request supervised preservation inspection before litigation discovery begins. Carl's expression hardened. You already filed? Yesterday morning. Denise inhaled quietly. Small-town banks rarely faced serious litigation. Most disputes involved loan defaults, equipment repossessions, or boundary disagreements between neighboring farms. Corporate attorneys usually handled matters remotely through email and settlement forms. But this felt different. Older. Heavier. Like somebody had opened a locked room nobody remembered existed. Carl glanced toward the waiting customers. Everybody needs to clear the counter area, he announced firmly. Bank business only. Nobody moved immediately. Then slowly, awkwardly, the contractor stepped backward first. Others followed toward the chairs, though several remained close enough to hear pieces of the conversation. Daniel didn't seem bothered. He had probably expected witnesses. Carl lowered his voice again. What exactly do you think is inside that vault compartment? Elijah answered this time. Original lease maps. Carl looked at him. My father said they separated the public surveys from the private extraction reports after the second drilling assessment. That's impossible, Carl replied automatically. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Why impossible? Because if private surveys confirmed commercial reserves before foreclosure actions, Carl stopped himself halfway through the sentence. Daniel finished it calmly. Then the properties may have been intentionally undervalued before transfer. Silence again. One of the tellers quietly walked away from her station and disappeared into the employee hallway. Another kept pretending to organize deposit slips while obviously listening. Carl rubbed his jaw tightly. You're talking about events from nearly 50 years ago. Witnesses are dead. Institutions changed ownership multiple times. Half the people involved are gone. Daniel nodded. Paper survives longer than memory. That sentence seemed to land hardest on Denise. Because now she looked nervous too. Not guilty. Not implicated. Just suddenly aware that institutions carried history whether current employees understood it or not. Elijah carefully untied the cloth around his father's ledger. The book looked handmade, reinforced along the spine with strips of old leather stitched by hand. He opened it slowly to a marked page filled with neat blue handwriting. My father started recording meetings after the first reassessment notice, he explained quietly. Said numbers changed every time he asked questions. Daniel pointed toward one dated entry. Read that line. Elijah adjusted his glasses. November 17, 1978. Mr. Holbrook postponed review again after receiving confidential survey packet from Tulsa office. Said delays would stabilize transfer position before disclosure phase. Carl closed his eyes briefly. Because that wording sounded exactly like internal corporate language. Not something a rural farmer would invent casually decades later. Daniel spoke carefully now. Mr. Whitmore, I want to be very clear. We are not accusing your branch staff of wrongdoing. But if protected records still exist inside your archive system, failure to preserve them after formal notice creates exposure extending far beyond this county. Carl looked exhausted already. You think corporate doesn't already know about this? Daniel didn't answer directly. Instead, he removed a final document from the folder. A drilling rights acquisition map. Large sections of western Pine Hollow County had been highlighted in red. At the center sat parcels once owned by 6 farming families foreclosed between 1977 and 1983. One of those names was Turner. Another was Bishop. Another was Grady. Carl stared at the map. Then toward Elijah. Your father talked to the other families, didn't he? Elijah nodded once. After the auctions. And they kept records too. Some did. Daniel added quietly, 2 surviving families already signed participation agreements. Carl leaned heavily against the counter now. This was no longer one old man chasing ghosts. Patterns mattered in court. Especially repeated patterns. A ringing phone interrupted the silence. Denise answered automatically behind the desk, listened for several seconds, then looked toward Carl nervously. It's regional legal. Of course it was. News traveled quickly inside financial institutions once words like preservation order and successor liability entered the system. Carl took the receiver and walked several feet away, lowering his voice. But even from a distance, the tension across his face was obvious. Daniel used the pause to organize the documents calmly. Elijah looked around the lobby quietly, studying the same building his father once walked into decades earlier carrying foreclosure notices instead of evidence. Near the waiting area, an elderly woman stood slowly from her chair. Elijah? He turned. Recognition flickered across his face. Martha Grady, she said softly. The room shifted again. Because Grady was one of the names on the map. She walked closer carefully, eyes fixed on the ledger in his hands. I remember your father bringing papers to our house after the auctions, she whispered. My husband said nobody would ever believe him. Elijah's expression softened slightly. He kept anything. Martha hesitated. Then nodded. In the grain silo toolbox. Her voice grew quieter. I never threw them away. Daniel and Elijah exchanged one quick glance. Another witness. Another surviving archive. Another thread. Carl returned from the phone looking considerably paler than before. He placed the receiver down carefully. Then he looked directly at Daniel Mercer. Corporate counsel is on their way from Indianapolis. Daniel closed the archive box gently. I assumed they might be. Carl swallowed once before speaking again. They instructed us not to access the vault compartment until their attorneys arrive. Elijah finally spoke with the same calm tone he had used since entering the bank. That compartment hasn't moved in 42 years. He rested one hand lightly atop the metal cash box. It can wait another hour. Rain began falling outside just after noon. At first it tapped lightly against the bank windows, soft enough that most people barely noticed. But within minutes, dark clouds swallowed the valley sky and heavy water rolled across Main Street in silver sheets. Cars passing outside slowed near the curb, tires hissing against wet pavement. Inside the lobby, nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. The original line of customers had dissolved into small clusters of quiet conversation near the chairs and coffee station. Even people who completed their banking stayed longer than necessary, pretending to check phones or review receipts while waiting to see what happened next. Because Pine Hollow rarely saw outsiders arrive with Federal Archive seals and litigation orders. And people sensed this story had history buried beneath it. Daniel Mercer sat calmly at a small desk near the loan office hallway reviewing documents while Elijah remained near the counter, hands folded over his cap. Neither man appeared impatient. That unsettled Carl Whitmore more than anger would have. Experienced bankers understood emotional customers. Angry people shouted. Nervous people threatened lawsuits they never filed. Desperate people negotiated. But patient people were dangerous. Patient people arrived prepared. Denise returned from the employee hallway carrying fresh coffee she clearly didn't want. She placed one cup near Carl carefully. "You should probably drink something." Carl ignored it. He kept staring through the glass walls of his office toward Elijah Turner. Finally he spoke quietly. "You know what bothers me?" Denise hesitated. "What?" He doesn't look surprised. She followed his gaze. Elijah stood exactly where he had been nearly 40 minutes earlier, calm and silent despite the tension spreading through the building. Carl rubbed his forehead. Most people walk into a bank with accusations from the 70s hoping somebody panics. They bluff. They exaggerate. He lowered his voice further. This man acts like he already knows what's in that compartment. Denise glanced toward the archive boxes. "You think he does?" Before Carl could answer, the front doors opened again. 3 people entered together carrying umbrellas against the storm. The first was a tall woman in a charcoal business coat carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. Behind her walked a younger associate with a rolling case of files. The third man wore a dark regional compliance jacket bearing the Midstate Agricultural Bank insignia. Corporate. The entire lobby recognized it immediately. Conversation stopped. The woman approached the counter directly without acknowledging the customers watching her. "Claire Holloway," she said crisply, extending a hand toward Carl. "Senior Litigation Counsel." Carl shook it quickly. "Thanks for coming." Claire's eyes shifted immediately toward Daniel Mercer. Recognition flickered across both faces almost instantly. "Interesting. Daniel. Claire. So they knew each other. That changed things again." Claire removed her gloves slowly. "I reviewed your filing during the drive." Her tone remained controlled, professional. "You moved faster than usual." Daniel closed the folder he'd been reading. "You taught me efficiency." A few people nearby exchanged glances. Former colleagues. That explained the procedural precision. Claire turned toward Elijah next. "You're Mr. Turner." "Elijah. I'm sorry for the delay." Elijah gave a small nod but said nothing. Claire studied him for several seconds before looking toward the metal cash box beside the counter. "Is that his ledger?" "Yes," Daniel answered. Claire exhaled carefully. For the first time since arriving, some emotion slipped through her professional composure. Not fear exactly. Recognition. And to everyone's surprise, Martha Grady stepped forward from the waiting area. "I'm coming too." Claire paused. "Ma'am, this isn't public access." "My husband signed one of those foreclosure papers in 1980, Martha replied steadily. "If those files concern our property, I'm not sitting upstairs while strangers open them." Daniel looked toward Claire. After a moment, she nodded once. "Fine." Carl keyed open the secured hallway door reluctantly. The corridor beyond felt colder than the lobby above. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as they walked past records rooms, employee lockers, and locked archive storage marked with faded inventory labels from previous decades. At the far end sat a reinforced steel door requiring dual authorization access. Carl stopped there. This area contains inactive institutional records. Claire extended her hand. Keys. Carl hesitated only briefly before complying. Denise remained upstairs managing the increasingly curious customers while the others entered the archive level below. The room smelled like dust, paper, and old metal shelving untouched for years. Thousands of boxes lined narrow aisles beneath faded labels referencing mergers, acquisitions, foreclosures, mineral leases, and estate holdings dating back generations. Elijah looked around slowly. My father came here once. Carl frowned. That's impossible. In '82, Elijah said quietly. After they denied his appeal. Daniel glanced toward him. He told you that? He said a young clerk accidentally left the elevator unlocked. Claire checked the affidavit reference again. Compartment C-19. Carl led them deeper between the shelves until they reached a locked wire storage cage at the rear corner of the archive room. Dust covered nearly everything inside. Several compartments stood empty. Others contained forgotten binders collapsing from age. Then Carl stopped moving. Because directly ahead sat compartment C-19. Still sealed. Still locked. Still carrying a faded custody tag dated October 14, 1984. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Claire stepped closer carefully. The original wax seal remained intact beneath decades of dust. Daniel looked toward Elijah quietly. Your father really did preserve it. Elijah stared at the compartment without blinking. He said truth survives longer when buried by careful people. Carl swallowed hard. Claire removed a pair of evidence gloves from her portfolio slowly. Then she looked toward everyone in the room. From this moment forward, she said carefully, everything removed from this compartment becomes subject to formal legal preservation. The rain thundered above them through the ceiling pipes. Claire inserted the first key. Carl inserted the second. And 42 years after somebody sealed the compartment shut. The lock finally turned open. The lock released with a dull metallic click that echoed softly through the archive room. Nobody moved at first. Years of dust coated the compartment door so heavily that Claire had to wipe part of it clean before pulling it outward. The hinges groaned from disuse, revealing a narrow storage space packed tightly with document boxes wrapped in aging brown paper. Every package carried handwritten labels. Transfer assessments. Lease projections. Parcel reclassification. Confidential survey addendums. Carl Whitmore looked physically ill. Daniel Mercer remained completely still, studying the labels without touching anything yet. Experienced litigators knew the first few moments mattered. Chain of custody. Witnesses. Condition verification. Claire carefully removed a small recorder from her portfolio. Archive review beginning at 12:47 p.m., she stated professionally. Present parties include Mid-State Agricultural Bank Regional Counsel, branch management, claimant representatives, and witness participant Martha Grady. Her associate began photographing everything immediately. Elijah stared quietly at the shelves inside the compartment. Not triumphant. Not emotional. Just deeply focused. As if he had spent decades imagining this exact moment and still didn't entirely trust it was real. Claire lifted the first box carefully and placed it on a nearby table. The cardboard nearly collapsed beneath her fingers. Daniel opened the lid slowly. Inside sat dozens of organized folders tied with fading cloth ribbons. Geological maps rested beneath them alongside property ledgers and typed memorandums stamped confidential property review. Carl stepped closer despite himself. Daniel removed one document carefully. Then another. Then a third. Each page deepened the silence. Internal reserve estimates. Pre-foreclosure mineral valuations. Acquisition sequencing schedules. And scattered throughout the files, repeated references to something called phase delay strategy. Claire took one page from Daniel and read it twice. Her jaw tightened almost invisibly. "What is it?" Martha asked quietly. Claire answered without looking up. These reports estimated underground lease values before foreclosure proceedings were completed. Martha's hand slowly covered her mouth. Daniel spread several maps across the table. Colored markings identified drilling corridors beneath family-owned farmland across western Pine Hollow County. Next to many parcels sat handwritten notes referencing temporary agricultural insolvency positioning. Carl stared at the phrase. "That can't mean what I think it means." Daniel looked at him calmly. "It usually does." Elijah finally stepped closer. "There," he said softly. He pointed toward a folded survey map near the bottom of the box. Daniel opened it carefully. The room fell silent again. Because the map showed something none of them expected. Not just 6 farms. 14. 14 separate agricultural properties highlighted across nearly 2 decades of foreclosure actions. Some transferred to shell holding companies. Others acquired through intermediary auctions. All eventually tied to energy leasing groups years later. Claire leaned against the table slightly. "This is far bigger than the original filing." Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Martha stared at one highlighted parcel near the southern edge. "My brother's farm," she whispered. "They said his irrigation debt buried him." Daniel checked the attached notation. He lost the property 11 months before exploratory drilling approval. Carl rubbed both hands over his face now. This would have required coordination across multiple departments. "Likely," Claire agreed quietly. "People would have known." "Probably." The weight of that realization settled heavily across the archive room. Not one corrupt employee. Not one forged signature. A system. Structured enough to survive decades unnoticed beneath mergers and acquisitions. Claire carefully opened another folder. Inside sat correspondence between regional land acquisition officers and outside consulting firms. Most pages contained ordinary procedural language. Until Daniel stopped at one paragraph midway through a memo dated February 1981. He read it silently first. Then aloud. "Accelerated transfer completion remains critical before public release of revised extraction forecasts. Agricultural owners must not gain negotiating leverage during acquisition phase." Nobody spoke afterward. Because the meaning was painfully clear. If struggling farmers learned valuable gas reserves existed beneath their land, foreclosure settlements would become far more expensive. So the information stayed hidden. Martha sat slowly in the nearest chair. "My husband knew," she whispered faintly. "He kept saying the numbers made no sense." Elijah looked toward her gently. "My father said they counted on people feeling too small to fight institutions." Carl turned sharply toward Daniel. "You really think this holds up after 40 years? Daniel met his eyes evenly. "Paper trails don't expire morally." Claire added quietly, "Legally, some claims might. Others won't." She removed another document from the second box. Then stopped cold. Her expression changed instantly. Daniel noticed immediately. "What?" Without answering, Claire handed him the page. Daniel read the first lines. Then slower. Then once more. Carl stepped closer nervously. "What is it?" Daniel looked toward Elijah. "It's a distribution schedule." Elijah frowned slightly. "For what?" Daniel placed the page on the table where everyone could see it. Typed beneath several corporate account references sat a line item marked. "Special compensation allocation, executive retention bonuses following rural transfer completion initiative." And beneath that heading appeared a list of payment approvals tied directly to completed foreclosure clusters. Including Pine Hollow County. Carl whispered softly, "Jesus Christ." Claire folded her arms tightly now. This changes exposure significantly. Because now the document suggested motive. Not merely hidden information. Profit. Structured financial incentive. Daniel carefully reorganized the files. We stop here for today. Carl blinked. That's it? For now, Daniel replied. These materials need forensic cataloging before formal production. Claire nodded reluctantly. He's right. Elijah remained staring at the old survey map spread across the table. After several seconds, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a worn black and white photograph. His father. Standing beside a tractor near the original Turner property sometime in the late 70s. Elijah placed the photograph gently beside the foreclosure maps. My father died believing nobody would ever open this compartment. Martha looked down at the picture quietly. He wasn't wrong to keep fighting. For the first time all day, emotion finally touched Elijah's face. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Relief. The kind carried by someone who spent years protecting a promise made to a dying parent. Upstairs, faint movement echoed through the pipes as customers continued talking about the strange legal meeting happening beneath the bank. But down in the archive room, the atmosphere felt entirely different now. Heavier. Permanent. Because everyone present understood the same thing at the exact same moment. This was no longer about one quiet farmer walking into a bank. It was about an entire town slowly realizing that some of its worst tragedies may never have been accidents at all. By 3 o'clock, the storm above Pine Hollow had weakened into a steady gray drizzle. Word had already spread across town. Not through newspapers or television crews. Pine Hollow was too small for that kind of attention. News traveled here through hardware stores, church parking lots, gas stations, and pickup trucks stopped beside muddy roads. People heard pieces first. Elijah Turner went to the bank. Corporate lawyers showed up. Old records were opened downstairs. Foreclosure files were found. By the time Claire Holloway and Daniel Mercer emerged from the archive level carrying sealed evidence containers, nearly every chair in the lobby was occupied again. Nobody pretended not to watch anymore. Carl Whitmore walked behind them looking 10 years older than he had that morning. Denise remained frozen behind the counter as conversations stopped across the room. Daniel placed the sealed containers carefully atop the counter. Claire addressed the room before anyone could ask questions. These materials are now under formal preservation review. No further public statements will be made today. But people weren't really listening to her. They were watching Elijah. The same man most of them ignored when he entered carrying a dented metal cash box. Martha Grady stepped beside him slowly. My husband told me not to burn his papers before he died, she said quietly enough for several nearby customers to hear. I thought grief was making him stubborn. An older rancher near the coffee station spoke up suddenly. Bishop family lost their land the same year the drilling leases started north of the creek. Another voice answered from near the entrance. My uncle too. The room shifted again. Patterns. Once people recognized one pattern, they started remembering others. Carl stepped forward carefully, trying to regain some professional control over the situation. Everyone needs to understand there are legal procedures involved here. Nothing has been concluded. Daniel nodded slightly. That's true. Then he added something far more important. But records matter. Silence followed. Because deep down, rural communities understood documents better than speeches. Land deeds. Tax records. Loan agreements. Probate papers. Families built entire lives around what was written down and preserved. And now old records were speaking again. Elijah finally picked up the metal cash box from the counter. For a moment it looked strangely small compared to the sealed archive container surrounding it. 40 years of waiting reduced to old paper and handwritten notes. Claire approached him quietly. Mr. Turner. Elijah. She nodded once. Elijah, corporate counsel will likely pursue settlement discussions before this reaches open court. Several nearby customers leaned closer immediately. But Elijah surprised everyone with his answer. This was never only about money. Claire studied him carefully. What then? Elijah looked around the bank lobby slowly. At the tellers. The waiting customers. The old historical photograph hanging behind the counter. My father used to say people disappear twice, he said calmly. Once when they die. And again when nobody remembers what was done to them. Nobody in the room spoke. Even Daniel remained silent. Elijah rested one hand on the sealed evidence container nearest him. These families weren't careless. They weren't stupid. Most of them worked themselves into the ground trying to save land they never understood was already worth more than the debt hanging over it. Martha wiped at her eyes quietly. Carl looked down at the floor. And for the first time all day, Denise Carter seemed genuinely ashamed of how quickly she dismissed the old farmer at the counter. Outside, rainwater rolled slowly along the curb beneath the dark afternoon sky. Daniel checked his watch before turning toward Elijah. We should go. Elijah nodded. But before leaving, he reached into the cash box one final time and removed the original yellowed envelope he handed Denise earlier that morning. Carefully, he slid it back across the counter toward her. You keep it, he said. Denise looked startled. Why? Because someday another quiet person might walk in here carrying papers everybody thinks are too old to matter. She accepted the envelope slowly. The entire lobby watched Elijah Turner place his cap back onto his head and walk toward the front doors beside Daniel Mercer and Martha Grady. Nobody moved aside immediately. Then gradually, customers created space for him without a word. Not out of fear. Out of respect. The doors opened. Cold rain air drifted inside. And as Elijah stepped outside beneath the gray Pine Hollow sky, several people in the lobby began pulling out phones to call relatives, neighbors, brothers, cousins. Asking the same question. Do we still have Grandpa's old foreclosure papers? Behind the counter, Carl Whitmore stared at the historical photograph mounted on the wall. The original Pine Hollow Cooperative building. Smiling executives standing proudly beside farmers who trusted them decades earlier. For the first time, Carl noticed how many of those farmers were gone now. And downstairs beneath the bank, inside sealed archive containers waiting for federal review, thousands of forgotten pages were finally moving back into the light. Not because a powerful corporation decided to confess. Not because politicians intervened. Not because reporters uncovered a scandal. Because one quiet farmer walked into a bank carrying a metal cash box. And refused to let his